right, welcome everybody. My name is Wim de Koort, and for the next hour or so, we will be talking about FileMaker Server. So why me? I've always believed that FileMaker Server is the crucial keystone to all of our FileMaker Server deployments, right? Without a stable FileMaker Server, without a secure FileMaker Server, without any scalability on that end, and without us knowing exactly how our solution behaves, what it does, a lot of our deployments would be in trouble, right? So to me, it really is that crucial keystone. And because of that, I live and breathe FileMaker Server. And obviously, the title of the session is a spiel on this book here, right? Because for all of us who have known the FileMaker Server going back to Server 13, which is when the last iteration of its UI was introduced, it certainly feels like everything has changed, right? So that we don't recognize anything anymore, and that can make us a little uncertain, right? So there's new tools to discover, there's new ways of doing the same thing, and we'll have to wrap our heads around that a little bit. So just to be sure that we're all on the same page, right? I'll start with a high-level overview of the things that are new, the things that have changed, and the things that are no longer there. And then we will dive into the new stuff mostly, the admin API, the command line, and the API. Right? So right off the bat, what has changed? And obviously the admin console is the big one, right? That's the interface that we typically almost always use to interact with our FileMaker Server, and that's brand new. So that's obvious. The admin command line interface has also been updated in line with some of the changes that we have in the console and in the API. And we'll go over both of those in a lot of detail a little later. The data API is in its first official release with Server 17, right? So we've had it with 16, but the one that we have in 17 is different than the one that we have in 16, right? So if you have done a lot of work in the data API on 16, you will find that what we have now is different. The endpoints are slightly different, some of the syntax is different. So it's different enough that we will talk about it, and we will talk specifically what it means to FileMaker Server, right? What is it in FileMaker Server that makes this run and that we can leverage? And the default SSL behavior has also changed in 17. FileMaker Server has always had a default SSL certificate that you could just use, and it did cover the client-to-server connections. It doesn't do that anymore in 17, right? So the way that you think about the default SSL certificates has changed, and we really all should be using a custom SSL certificate at this point. Completely new is, of course, the admin API, and we will cover that in some detail. And then two smaller ones. FileMaker Server now has what it's called a secure folder, and I will show you one in my admin console. And it was introduced largely because anything you put in that folder has to follow the same rules as any files that you put on FileMaker Cloud, right? And with the new licensing that we have with FileMaker Server, if you have the standard license, the non-concurrency license, then you are entitled to 3 servers, which is, in my mind, one of the biggest beneficial changes to the licensing model that we have seen in a long, long time, right? So you're entitled to 3 servers with your license if you have the right license, and one of them can be a FileMaker Cloud. So this secure folder and the way that behaves, and to make the behavior consistent between your on-premise FileMaker Server and your FileMaker Cloud server, it'll make that transition very easy, right? So anything you put in that secure folder will behave exactly the same, follow the same rules for encryption, what accounts you can have enabled, the guest account, all of these rules. So it'll behave the same between your on-premise server and your FileMaker Cloud server. And when you install FileMaker Server, you will get a default midnight backup that will be enabled and is running. We'll cover that as we go through the admin console as well. And then we have a couple of things that have been removed, that are no longer in FileMaker Server. And the first one is the ability to create an SSL signing request, right? And it's just the ability to do that from the console. You can still obviously generate the signing request, but it's done from the command line right now, so it's no longer in the admin console. Completely gone is the feature that allowed us to provide a standby server, right? I think introduced with FileMaker Server 15, we could set up a standby server, and any changes to the primary server would get synced automatically to the standby server, and you can bring them up. I did a big presentation on that in 2015, so you can probably still find that if you don't know what it is. So I'm looking forward to see what we get from FileMaker Server to replace this in the future, but for now, it's no longer there. Also removed is the ability to set up sub-admins. That was a feature where you could put some files in a particular folder on your FileMaker server and then give a restricted group of users access to the admin console so that they can do some actions on those files in that particular folder, right? So that's no longer there. Also gone is the LDAP registration. Personally, very, very happy to see that one gone because it caused no end of confusion. And just to be perfectly clear, it has nothing to do with authentication, right? It was just a way to locate your FileMaker server, to find it on your network, right? So no interactions, no implications at all to authenticating users into your solution. So that is gone. Good riddance. The thing that most people will miss the most, I would imagine, is the ability to see live statistics and live events of the things that happen on your FileMaker server, with your solutions, right? So those things have not been removed from FileMaker server, but they are no longer visible in your admin console. And we'll cover that and how you basically replace that, I guess, a little later in the presentation as well. Now, before we dive into the details of the admin console and the admin API, I want to draw your attention to 3 white papers that have been released when FileMaker 17, the product line, was released. So you'll find them at that URL. They were co-authored with Stephen Blackwell and myself. And now that I think of it, that makes 2 people with funny accents. So there is one that describes everything that has to do with the admin console, the admin API, and the admin command line. The second one specifically talks about monitoring your FileMaker server, right? Looking at the events, looking at the stats. And then there's a third one about SSL, what it does, what it doesn't do, and how you get going with a custom SSL certificate. Now that first one, the one that talks about the admin console API and CLI, it's a long one, right? It's over 80 pages. And it's so long because it has 2 very useful sections in it. There's an Appendix A there that if you are currently familiar, or you were familiar with the admin console as we used to have it, from FileMaker Server 13 through 16, that appendix is basically a big rundown, side by side, of the old admin console and the new one, right? So if you are familiar with the old one, you can use this one to very quickly find the stuff that you know where it is in the old console and figure out where is it in the new console, or do I have to go to the command line or use the admin API to do the same thing. And there's a second appendix in there along the same lines, but it lists all the rows are basically common admin actions that you would want to do on your FileMaker server. And the columns there is basically, is it available in the console? Is it available in the admin API? Is it available in the command line interface, right? And it gives you a little hint as to what that looks like over at the API side or the command line. So that can help you very quickly get oriented with the new tools that we have, both the console, the admin API, and the command line interface. So the rest of this section will be broken down into these parts. So we will talk about what tools we have to administer our FileMaker server. Then we will talk about how can we keep track of how it's behaving, what's happening on the server. And then we'll talk briefly about the data API. So administering your FileMaker server is possible through these 3 touch points, as we call them, right? The admin console, admin API, admin command line interface. And the console, like I said, is the obvious one, right? It's the one that most of us will use the most. And it looks completely different than the one we had. If you are a little bit familiar with the console on the FileMaker Cloud, you'll recognize it because it looks the same. It has some slight differences, but in essence, it's the same thing. One of the reasons for the redesign was to make sure that the admin console had less of an impact on the performance of your FileMaker server. The old console was actually fairly top-heavy. It took quite a bit of resources to make it run. and every time you brought it up, you were consuming more resources on that server than what you will do now when you have the admin console. So that was one of the main reasons. And obviously, just to tackle the elephant in the room, I guess, yes, it has fewer settings than the old admin console, right? So we will talk about that. We will talk about where they are and how you get to it. But I really want to make sure that we all understand that a lot of these settings have not been removed from the product, right? They're just in a different place. So we can still get to them, we can still use them, they just don't happen to be where we would expect to find them sometimes. All right, so logging into our admin console, the first thing you see is the dashboard, right? And there's some very useful information about what the number of files you have currently running, how many connected clients you have, the state of your SSL certificates, so that you can see how long it's still valid. You see some of the data API usage, right? How are you doing against your allowance there? And obviously we have the little graphs at the bottom that gives us a little information about the disk space usage. It's only the drive that happens to be the one where FileMaker Server is installed. So if you have a multi-drive system, it's not going to report you any free disk space or disk usage across all the drives you have in your machine, right? And the same with the 3 traditional bottlenecks that we have, right? So any machine can have 4 potential bottlenecks. It's going to be memory usage, processing, disk I/O, and network throughput. So we can see some numbers across those potential bottlenecks right there. But keep in mind that these come from the operating system, right? Those are not the same as the live statistics that we used to have in the old console. And the timeline only goes back 3 minutes, right? So it can give you good information about what's happening on your server right now. It's not the best tool to troubleshoot what happened an hour ago, right? So because it doesn't give you that information, you can't make this wider. So keep that in mind, right? Because we've seen some community posts where people were talking about the memory usage of their server, and just by looking at this graph, we don't want you to draw any conclusions about the long-term running of your FileMaker Server just by looking at a 3-minute window, right? So that's something to keep in mind. If we jump over to the database section, on the left-hand side, you'll see all the files that you have hosted. On the right-hand side, you'll see the clients that are currently connected. So I have 2 clients currently connected, and I see all my files there. There are some symbols next to each file, right? So if the file is currently running, if it's FileMaker Server has it open, you will see that blue dot. If it's in the process of being closed or being opened, it'll be a red dot. If it's a gray dot, then FileMaker Server doesn't have this file currently hosted, right? So nobody can connect to it. You'll also see a symbol there to indicate whether the file is encrypted or not. And when you see the little folder icon, it typically means that that particular file is in the additional database folder, not in the main database folder. So that's what it means. And there's a little symbol there for a folder with a black lock icon on that. That means that that particular file is in the secure folder. That special folder that I talked about briefly, that makes it behave exactly like FileMaker Cloud. So that's what it looks like. If you click on the drop-down that sits at the top there of all your files, you have this view here with to view the extended privileges. That's the equivalent of the old console. Basically had your files listed, and then it had columns for your different technologies, so to speak, and it would indicate which of your files were XML enabled, PHP enabled, these kinds of things. So you can get that from clicking this particular selection here, right? So it'll update the UI, and underneath each file, it'll tell you for what technologies, for what extended privileges it has been enabled, right? So it's one of these things where you may not find it's intuitive, or you may think it's been removed, but it's still there. I want to call out the search button because it's one of those features that you start using immediately and you don't even realize that it's so vastly different than what we had before. Pretty much all of the panes that we have on the admin console, you can search and filter just by typing something in. It's one of the great additions to the admin console. So make sure to use it. It's pretty damn good. If we jump one over, we get to the backups. And there's a couple of things going on here, and I've alluded to some of them already. Over on the left-hand side, we have that midnight backup, right? And as I mentioned, when you install FileMaker Server, you automatically get a backup that is scheduled to run at midnight. And you can see from mine that I have it disabled, and I'll explain how you can disable it in case that the midnight time frame is not the best time frame for you to have a backup run. So we'll get to that. Underneath that, you have some, right there, you have the ability to preserve some backups and see those backups. It keeps 8 backups of those nightly midnight backups. You can only preserve a backup if it's one of those midnight backups, right? The preservation of backups doesn't apply to any backups that you may set up yourself over on the right-hand side. So that's what that divider is about there in the middle. Now, if I make a quick trip to my admin command line, and we'll do this again a little later, and I ask the FileMaker Server command line interface for my list of schedules, you'll see that I actually have 4 schedules, right? 1 through 4. There's 3 backup ones, and there's 1 message one. We'll get to that one later. But I see 3 backups, right? Over on the top, I only see 2 backups. The right-hand side of the admin console, that's just the backups that I have created, my backups, right? The ones that I've explicitly configured. The midnight backup is returned by asking for the list of schedules, and it's the one with ID number 1 with the name FMS. That's your midnight backup right there, right? So, and I have it disabled, as we could see over on that side as well. So the question is to ask for, basically is asking for a little more information about the ability to preserve backups, something that you can do right here. If you're familiar with FileMaker Cloud, you can preserve backups on FileMaker Cloud as well. So this basically brings that ability to that midnight backup schedule to your on-premise backup. And what it really means is that if you choose to preserve a backup, as I said, it keeps 8 backups, so it basically rolls through your backups, the midnight backups. If you want to keep one, that's when you would say preserve this one, and it will not automatically delete it as it cycles through its backups. The preservation is an individual backup by definition. For the midnight backup, you don't get to choose how many you want to keep. You can do that for your schedules, right? For your schedules, you have the same freedom as setting up backup schedules like we had in the old server. Nothing has changed there. You still get to decide how many you want to keep. The backup schedule and the preservation, that's just for the default schedule, the one that is enabled automatically when you install FileMaker Server. All right, so just keep that in mind. On the right-hand side, when you go to your console, you will not see your midnight backup listed, except there on the left-hand side, and it'll tell you whether it's enabled or disabled. But you can't disable it from the console, right? So I'll show you how to disable it later in the session. But your FMS admin list schedules command will show you everything that you have schedule-wise, backups and other ones. The other thing that we see on the left-hand side there is the progressive backups. Not a new feature, nothing much has changed there. The only thing that you'll not get in the admin console is the ability to change the interval at which these progressive backups happen. You can still set it. You can set it from the command line, you can set it from the API. You cannot set it from the console. But that's why you have it listed there. We'll see it again when we get to the folders where you set up folders, additional folders and all these things. All right, if we do one more hop and we get to the configuration section, that's obviously, as the name implies, that's where most of the configurations are kept. And we'll go through some of these and just highlight some of what we see there. So it'll give you some information about where your server is running, IP addresses, DNS names, all of that good stuff. At the bottom, we still have the ability to set whether FileMaker Server and the web publishing engines should automatically start when the machine reboots. And the top one there has to do with whether FileMaker Server should automatically start hosting your files when it starts up. And you can see it's disabled. It's actually enabled by default. I always turn it off because I don't want anything to happen to my server. And it comes back up and it automatically starts hosting files and users start connecting to it. If something happens to my server that I didn't expect, I want my files to remain closed so that If I didn't catch it, my monitoring software didn't catch it, at the very least, my users will catch it because they can't get in anymore. And I have the opportunity to either go back to a backup or at the very least have a quick look at the event logs and see what happened to my server. So as a best practice, I would encourage you very much to turn that off as well. We have the ability, same as we had, to specify what kind of timeouts we have for our clients. We can enable the file list filtering. Basically, that will filter what files the user gets to see when they do the open remote, when they click on your host. So nothing has changed there. And this is where we get to specify the folders, like where's my main database folder? You can see it right there. Where is my secure database folder? Right, so that's the new one. That's the one that I mentioned a few times now. What is different in Server 17 and in 16 is the additional database server. If you're familiar with the old servers, you got to specify 2 additional database folders, right? Now you can only specify 1. So that's something to keep in mind. The rest of the settings are the same as we had. If we scroll down a little bit, you'll see the backup folders. So you can see what the default backup folder is. You can change it. You also see where the default progressive backups folder is. So now it's automatically configured for you, right? In Server 16 and before, you had to enable progressive backups and specify where you wanted them to go. And they couldn't be inside the FileMaker server folder structure. Now, all of that is made a little simpler, and it is actually inside the FileMaker folder structure, and it's configured automatically for you. And then we have our schedules, right? In the old server, all the schedules, backup, script schedules, message schedules, all of them were inside one widget, if you will, one UI. And now they're split up. You have our backup schedules that we've just went through a little bit ago, and this is where we see our script schedules, right? Now, you may think, well, we just saw that we have 4 schedules, right? We have 3 backup schedules, and we know that we can't see the midnight one in the console, except whether it's enabled or disabled. We have our 2 backup schedules that I created, but we also have this message schedule, right, that I created, and it's not in there. And the reason for that is that this particular section only shows you your script schedules, right? Any message schedules that you make are not going to be visible in the console. You can still get them, as we've seen from the command line. You'll also get them from the API. But this one is only about your script schedules, right? Your actual script schedules, your OS script schedules, and the combination of the 2, which is the script sequence schedules, right? Other than that, nothing has changed. You can still make them exactly the same as you could in Server 16 and before. The SSL certificates, when you go through the installation process for your FileMaker server, right, it's one of the very first questions that you get asked. If you haven't set up a FileMaker Server 17 yet, that whole process is very different. It's much easier, in fact, to go through that installation process of your FileMaker server. And it will ask you right off the bat, do you want to use the default SSL certificates, or do you want to right now import your custom one, right? So if you chose not to do your custom SSL certificate, you can come back in here and import it and get it up and running. And as we've mentioned during the slides that showed you what was removed from the product, there's no UI, there's no wizard here to get going with that certificate signing request. So you may have to make a trip to the command line for that, like we had to do with Server 14 and 15 as well. The question is that coming in the future? I don't know. I don't work for FileMaker. I have no insights into what they'll bring back. But I will show you what you can do if you absolutely hate the command line. The community has already taken care of that, so you don't have to worry about it. We will talk about logging separately, so I can jump over to the connector section of your console, right? So that's where you can enable WebDirect and your web publishing engine. I got confused about this a little bit in the beginning because they're off by default, and I just wanted to enable WebDirect, so I went in there, toggle it off at the top and then move it away. But you actually also have to configure or toggle on your web publishing engine, because your WebDirect doesn't quite work without the web publishing engine. So keep that in mind if you just toggle it on and walk away. You have to do them. You have to do them together. If you had multiple worker machines, because we know that with WebDirect we can have multiple worker machines, they'll be listed there as you add them. This is where you can enable your data API, and this is also, it's also on the dashboard, as we saw in the beginning. This is where you can see how much usage you already have against your allowance, right? So, and the 120 gigs, that's basically the basic 5-user license. If you were in my IoT session yesterday, I went through some of these numbers, what they mean, and how much volume you can generate pushing data into FileMaker and not even come close to that allowance. So I think the allowance is pretty generous. And we'll talk about the data API at the end of this section. And then this is the admin section of the admin console, right? So if you upgrade your server license, this is where you can go to install the license key. The license key, pretty much, if you leave it in your downloads folder, if you download it as part of your agreement and it's in the downloads folder, as you install FileMaker Server will look in the downloads folder, so it'll automatically pick up on your license key. If you'd moved it somewhere else, you can still get through the installation process of FileMaker Server. It'll basically install as a trial, and then you can come into this section and load your license key and have it applied and get out of trial mode. On the external authentication side, nothing has changed, right? We still have our 3 traditional external authentication models, Microsoft Active Directory, Apple's Open Directory, and local accounts and groups on the FileMaker Server machine, plus the 3 OAuth ones, Amazon accounts, Google accounts, and Microsoft Azure AD. And this is where you come to configure them. Nothing has changed, right? So I want to make sure that, jumping very quickly back to that LDAP registration that was removed from the product, that had nothing to do with this, right? So no, actually, it may have been named differently. I don't quite remember. I would have to look in my admin console. But the thing to remember at this section is for logging into the admin console. This section is for logging into your files. Right? So for logging into the admin console, we don't have all the external authentication providers that you have available to you for giving users access to your files. Right? So we have to make that distinction between logging into the admin console and who you can give access to that versus who you give access to logging into your solution. All right, so that was a very quick walkthrough of the new admin console. So here are some of the settings that we had in our old admin console, right? So the ability to set the limit, the number of FileMaker Pro connections, right? The ability to set the number of simultaneous perform script on server sessions that your server could deal with, your maximum number of FileMaker files to host, the amount of database cache that you want to assign in memory, and the interval at which you want to collect statistics, and the ability to toggle on and off what logs you want to collect, or that you want your FileMaker Server to collect, right? I want to stress that these have not been removed from the platform, right? They're still there. They're just not in your admin console. And we'll cover some of these as we go through the API and the CLI. For me, this is my biggest fear, right? I don't want people to only look at the admin console, especially if they're new to the platform. If they know that we could do this before, they'll probably find a way to do this again, especially with the white papers and all of this. But for a complete newcomer to come to FileMaker platform, install their FileMaker Server, or have IT install their FileMaker Server, and IT may ask, can we change the database cache, right? And then the user will go to the admin console and decide, nope, can't do it. That feature doesn't exist in FileMaker. I want to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to the fact that these features are still there, right? It's just a matter of finding the right interface to use them, right? So these features have not been removed. They have been removed from the console. They haven't been removed from FileMaker Server. So I really want to stress that. And with that, we can jump straight into the admin command line interface. And the two biggest changes there have to do with the get and with the set command, right? So those are the new commands that have been added to the command line interface. The command line interface as such has been around for a long time, right? And it's a great tool for a couple of different reasons. One, because it's a command line, we can script it, right? We can roll into whatever admin actions that we want to do on our server, from reboots to anything that comes along those lines. So it's scriptable because it's command line. It also works exactly the same on Windows as it does on Mac, right? There's no syntax differences in how you make your calls to the admin, the command line interface on Mac or on Windows, right? So get and set. Some of those features that we just talked about that you will not find in your admin console, you can change now with the get and set commands. Right, so this is a very quick demo of that command line interface, right? So I don't expect you to walk away from this session and be a full expert on the command line interface if you've never done it before, but I want to show you that it's not that hard, it's not that difficult to get into, right? So if you do FMS admin help commands, you'll get all of them. And then if you want help on one particular one, you basically do FMS admin help and the name of the command that you just got from the list. And there you go. Now, there's a lot there, right? So I'm pausing this a little bit so we can get into this. And this is the help for the new command, for the get. With get, you can ask FileMaker Server for what the current configuration settings are. And there's two big sections to it, right? So there's FileMaker Server FMS admin gets server config and CWP config, right? And then for the server config, we have these commands that we can ask it, and for the basically the web configuration, we have these that we can use. So that's basically how you read that particular help in there. So with that, I can now basically just say, okay, let's see what my server config settings are. So if I do FMS admin get server config, FileMaker Server will tell me what my available settings are. It'll tell me what my current setting is, and also very helpfully, it will tell me what my minimum and my maximum is, what the range is of what I can apply there. So if I want to change, say, two of those settings, I do set server config. I pick the name of the one that I'm updating my cache to 800 megabytes and my available pro connections. There we go. So I can do it with one command, and when I execute it, FileMaker Server tells me, oh, I got them, and those are your new values. So if I do the same thing again now for just the gets, I will see all of my settings, including the ones that I've just changed. Right? So that's how easy it is to make these changes using the get and the set, right? The get will tell you what they are. With the set, you can just change them. You don't have to guess at the names for these things. You don't have to memorize them. The help is actually really, really good. And if you do just the FMS admin get, it will tell you the name of the settings that you need to use. And you can just go ahead and do that. Now, the list schedules is the one that I had a screenshot of in my previous slides. And that will tell you what your current schedules are, backup and script schedules and message schedules. Now, that first one, and that's how you enable and disable that default midnight backup, right? That's how I do it. So obviously, I had it disabled, so I'm just enabling it here now. It's as simple as FMS admin enable schedule 1. And the 1 I get from all the way over on the left-hand side, right? That's the ID of that schedule. And since it's the one that comes with FileMaker, it was the first one ever created, so it'll have ID 1. It'll have ID 1 on all of our deployments, so that's easy enough to remember, right? So with this thing enabled, and you can see, by the way, that it's the next run is at midnight, so it'll just go ahead and run it. If I leave it enabled, it'll run at midnight today. So if you want to disable it, it's basically just the same command, right? So FMS admin disable schedule 1, and the default backup schedule will be gone. So the question is, as you can see from the commands, as I was typing in, I just typed in FMS admin, and it worked. I didn't have to navigate to where the FMS admin executable lives to make this happen. Used to be, you had to either add the whole path to where FMS admin, the executable, lived to make this work. That has been changed a couple of versions ago. So it'll work from anywhere, same as on Mac. So you don't have to be in a particular spot on your command line to make this happen. All right, so we've been over the admin console, we've been over the command line interface. The third admin touchpoint is the admin API, and that's the brand new one, right? That's the one that's been introduced with Server 17. And this one is really powerful, right? I really like this one. And just like the command line interface, because it's a REST-based API, it's entirely scriptable, right? Any scripting language you can find, any programming language out there can deal with a REST web service. Unlike the command line interface, you can talk to your FileMaker server from anywhere, right? With the command line interface, you have to be on the FileMaker server machine for the commands to be executed. With the API, it runs from anywhere. The screenshot is from the documentation that is installed on your FileMaker server, and it's excellent documentation, right? It'll tell you how to construct a URL, whether it's a post or a get or a patch or anything like that. It'll tell you what syntax, what JSON you need to send it if you need to send it something, and it'll tell you what you can expect back. So it's really well done. And to use the admin API just as a way of getting to know it, there's some great tools out there, open source, free ones, Postman, Fiddler. And our own community, the FileMaker community, has already built tools around this admin API that will do some of the things that we would like to do with the admin console that are not there, right? So we'll cover some of those as well. Right, so this is Postman, and this is what it looks like when you create or make some calls to that FileMaker server admin API. If you download those white papers that I mentioned in the beginning of the session, you will actually get a complete Postman collection. Every single admin API call that exists is available to you. You just open Postman, you import the collection, and you have it. And then you can just run through them and execute them. And I'll show you how that works in a second. Actually, I'll show you right now. So this is Postman. The admin API, like any API, works around the fact that you construct a URL, you pick an HTTP method, one of the available ones, you make sure that you have your headers and your bodies set correctly as per the documentation, and then you execute it. So if I log into my FileMaker server, you will see that I have everything going there. Now, Postman, and this is a little tech geek, but I want to call it out. In my Postman collection, the way that the admin API works is the same as how the data API works, right? So you authenticate to use it, right? You send a username and a password, the same ones that you would use if you log into the admin console. And what you get back when you authenticate is a token, right? That big thing you see at the bottom, that long string of text, that's your token. That token will be valid for 15 minutes if you don't use it. So for that duration of the validity of that token, when you make your next call, say you want to get a list of your schedules or a list of your users, you will pass that token, right? So you will not send the username and password every time that you want the admin API to do something. You will send that token. That token is basically your key to say that, that you have been authenticated and you're fine and your session is valid, right? So in that Postman collection, I have a little bit of JavaScript code that will automatically write it to a variable in Postman so that I don't have to bring it over and keep pasting it. So logging out is the same thing. You see that orange thing that I have there in curly brackets. That thing in orange is a Postman variable. And you'll see I have the same thing there in my URL for server. So Postman has an area where you can define variables. So for me to be able to use this against any server, I just store the name, the DNS name of my server in the variable area in Postman, and then reference it in all my calls. So I don't have to update 100 calls if I want to switch to a different server, right? So it's the same with the token. So it's a great way of working with that. Right, so if I want to get a list of my Databases and the users, I do the same thing. I make a URL, I pick an HTTP method, make sure that my headers are in there, including the token, and I get back JSON as per the documentation. And you can see some of the information that the API sends back to you. So it'll have information about all the files that you have open, what users are connected to those files, and the same for the clients. It'll tell you what clients you have and what files they have open. Now, if we jump to the configuration area, and this is very similar to what we've done from the command line, right? So the same thing, it's a URL. The URL is, you look up in the documentation what it should be. It's a GET because we're just asking for information, and you can see, I see my cache size, the maximum number of files I will allow it to host, the number of pro connections, and the maximum number of simultaneous perform script on server. Now, if I want to update this, I can just change the JSON here. The URL is going to be the exact same that I used for getting the configuration, but instead of using a GET, I'll tell it to do a patch. And that way, FileMaker Server Admin API will know that I want to update my settings. All right, my headers are going to be the same. It's JSON that we're sending. I have my token in there. My body is what I want to change. This is the endpoint or the URL, and it's a patch. I go off and send it, and FileMaker tells me I got no errors, right? So no error numbers. If I go back and ask, these are my old settings. If I ask now what my settings are, you'll see I'll get the updated ones. Right, so in a nutshell, that's how the admin API works. Very, very similar conceptually to the command line, except that it just looks a little different the way that you address it. This is how you enable or get information about the PHP configuration. Right? So as we went through the PHP, so the admin console, there was nothing there to enable or disable the XML API or the PHP API, but you can do it from the command line. You can do it from the admin API. Like here, right? So I'm basically just turning it off as we go here. I've just set it enabled to false. If I ask it again, these are my old values, and I say go ahead and update that, you will see that it comes back with enabled as false, right? So the same with the XML configuration. There's a lot of calls you can make to create schedules, edit schedules, run schedules. It's also a very good way to document your configuration, right? So you just make API calls to get your list of schedules, and it's JSON. You just store them, and if you want to reapply them, if you want to move them to another server, you feed the JSON to the next call to create a schedule, and away you go. So I basically just asked for my list of schedules, and if I basically just collapse the things, you'll see that we have the exact same schedules listed there as we saw when we asked for schedules from the command line. All right, so what I'll see here is my two schedules that I created, my two backup schedules and my message schedule are listed there. The default nightly backup one, the one that FileMaker creates, is not in that list, right? So that's the command line is the only place that you can interact with that nightly default backup schedule. All right, so I can run a schedule from here if I want to. All I need to do is insert, where it's in curly brackets there, I just need to insert the schedule ID that I can get from asking for my list of schedules, or do it from the command line, right? So that ID number on the left-hand side, that's the ID of the schedule, and I can just use it here to run a schedule. Now, obviously, you can use Postman and that collection of API calls that you can get when you download the white papers to just use them, right? So you can use it almost as a substitute admin console. But our community, our FileMaker community, has already come up with some great tools that use that admin API to do everything that we can conceivably do through that admin API with our FileMaker server, right? And a lot of them are FileMaker based. They're basically just FileMaker files that, because FileMaker is so damn good at integrating with things, you can call the admin API from inside FileMaker, right? Insert from URL, the curl JSON abilities, it's all there for us to use. And I have a URL there. It's now partly hidden behind my screenshot there. But there is a page on our community forum where the list of admin API wrappers, let's call them that, is maintained, right? So you go to that one page, you download the one that you like, and away you go. All of these are open, right? So they're all open source, for lack of a better word, so you can tweak them and change them. Well, this is probably my favorite from my good friend Klaus over at DataManix. So as you can see, it's basically just a FileMaker interface that allows you to make all the changes that you want to make. One of the reasons that I like this one is that if I look at the top section here, it basically makes all your REST admin API calls, but it also has great information about how you put your command line syntax together. It has a little helper, so you can just make the syntax here and copy and paste it in your command line. You can get to the web-based admin console in a web viewer, and this brings back that thing that was removed from the admin console, right? So you can use this to create your signing request. If you don't want to do it from the command line, just open this tool, plop in the information that you have. It basically does the same things as we could do in FileMaker 16 with the UI, with admin console UI, to generate the SSL certificate signing request. So you can do it from this tool. This one I like too, because it stays so close to the actual admin console, right? So, but it just added all the stuff that the admin console doesn't have that we can do through the admin API. So these two are FileMaker-based examples of what people have put together using that admin API. This one is from Soliant. It's hosted on GitHub, so it's open source. You can download it. You can contribute to it. This one is great because while the other ones basically replicate all the things that we were able to do before with the admin console, so basically it brings back feature parity with the old admin consoles, this one gives us something that we never had in any admin console, and that's the ability to see our schedules in a calendar. If you ever worked with a server that has a busy set of schedules, right, and you're just trying to read the list of schedules to see, okay, can I run this at 4 a.m. or should it be 4:30 a.m.? This will basically visualize all the schedules that you have right there in your calendar. And personally, I find that I can wrap my brain around this a whole lot better, right? So I think those two FileMaker-based examples, and this is a web-based one, right? It's all done in JavaScript. This shows us the potential of the admin API, right? The actual FileMaker console, the real admin console, that one runs on the admin API just like the other ones that people have put together, right? So it really comes down to our own creativity as to what we can do with that admin API and make it do exactly what we want it to do without having to wait for FileMaker to build these features for us. All right, so that was about about administering our FileMaker server through the console, the API, and the command line interface. We'll talk about monitoring our FileMaker server, right? And this is squarely where, going back to the beginning, where we could, in the old admin console, see the live statistics, see the live events. So what do we have now? And just to remind everybody, and I know that I'm repeating myself, it's just viewing these things that has been removed from the admin console, right? FileMaker server still collects these things. They're still available to us, and we can still see them. So if you happen to have your on-premise FileMaker server on Windows, the answer is simple, right? It's Perf1. It's built into Windows. It's great. You can use it on your FileMaker server. You can use it from a remote server. And FileMaker server has always done this, right? So FileMaker server has what is called in Perfmon terms performance counters, and you can see them here, and they are exactly the same ones as we had in the old view in our admin console, right? The exact same ones. They're also the same ones as FileMaker logs in the stats log. And this is not new to Server 17, right? So FileMaker server has been doing this all along. And again, if you download those white papers that I mentioned in the beginning, you'll actually get a full set of performance counters that are pre-set up. You can just import them into Windows Perfmon, and away you go. As you can see, I have 3 sets. The right one just mimics what the FileMaker server stats log does. So basically, we're talking about the counters that we see on the right-hand side. The other 2 are one's for 16, one's for 17. That is basically based off a a FileMaker knowledge base article that describes what we should be monitoring, right? And what FileMaker support may ask you to monitor if you run into trouble with your FileMaker server. So that one basically has everything that's in that knowledge base article for you to import into your perfmon, and away you go, right? And again, perfmon is great. It's a native Windows tool. It can be logged. It can roll over its logs. You can say, well, log it for the next 5 days, make a new log every hour. So those are all features that are already there. And frankly, those features are better than the features we had in the old admin console. So it's great to get to know it if you happen to have your server on Windows. On Mac, Mac OS doesn't have quite those same level of features as Windows Server has, but we have some. And the obvious one is our activity monitor, right? As I mentioned, a server can have 4 potential bottlenecks, right? Processing power, memory, disk I/O, and network throughput. And that's what the activity monitor brings us, right? It gives us some numbers across those 4 potential bottlenecks. And if we filter it down on the right-hand side to FMS, it'll show us the FileMaker server processes, and then you can see the numbers for those. And since macOS is based on Unix, we can use the Unix commands like top, and there's a few more if we want to use it in any scripted fashion, or if you're happy to be a little more familiar with the command line on macOS, then those are great tools for you. So that's basically just to see what your FileMaker server is doing behavior-wise, right? Is it using a lot of memory? Is it using a lot of processing? That's what we can get from the stats. We also want to see if FileMaker server or anything else on our server is generating any errors or warnings, right? So in the old admin console, we could see that in our live log viewer. In the new console, you can get to those logs, most of them, by going to the configuration section. At the bottom, there's the logging section. And there you can click and download the log to wherever you are, right? If you happen to be on the FileMaker server, or if you do this remotely, it'll actually download the log to you, and then you can open it in your favorite text editor or Excel, or import it into FileMaker, and then look at it that way. Above that, you see that we can enable the top call stats log from the admin console, right? And there's more logs, obviously, that FileMaker has. FileMaker has the traditional statistics log, it has the client stats log, and this top call stats log. Only the top call stats log can be enabled from here. The other ones, we have to make a trip to the command line to do that, right? So if we bring up the help for the enable command, and the enable command is the one that we use to disable and enable that backup schedule, right? But it does more than that. It also does the enabling or disabling of the 3 logs that we have, right? So we can enable the client stats log, the top call stats log, which we have in the admin console too, and then the server stats, that's your traditional, typical FileMaker server stats. I would, as a matter of best practice, I would highly encourage you to always turn on the server stats log, because once you enable that one, it stays on. The other 2, the client stats and the top call stats, are only on for as long as your FileMaker server is running, right? If you reboot your machine or you restart FileMaker server, these turn themselves back off. So you can enable them as you will, but the server stats, that one, I would say, always have it up and running, right? Because it's the one that will give you some solid numbers about how your FileMaker server is behaving, how your solution is behaving on your FileMaker server. And if you don't have the numbers, you just have an opinion, right? While the admin console allows you to download most of the logs, not all of them can be downloaded from the admin console. So for some of them, you will have to make a trip to the actual location of where FileMaker server keeps the logs, which is in the logs folder inside the FileMaker folder structure, right? So you can see them all listed there. The stats log, for instance, that's the traditional statistics log. That is the main one, in my opinion, that is not available to turn on in the admin console, and also not downloadable from the admin console, right? So this is where you'll find it. All right. We have some other ways to look at events as they happen, right? So again, on Windows, if that happens to be your platform for FileMaker server, for your on-premise server, we have the built-in application and system event viewer. And again, nothing new. FileMaker Server has been doing this for a long, long time. Everything that FileMaker Server writes to its own event log also gets written to the application event log, right? So you'll find them there. I tend to really like going here because it's one place where I can see what FileMaker Server logs and what other things log, right? So it's an opportunity for me to see everything in one place instead of having to piece it together from having to go to different sources and look at that information in a disjointed way. And just like the Perfmon, you can do this from any machine. Like any Windows machine, you can log into your FileMaker Server, if it happens to be on Windows, and see the logs from there, right? So you don't have to be on the FileMaker Server machine to have a look at that log. Now on Mac, you have the console app, right? The console app will give you access to most of the logs on your machine, system logs and otherwise. So you can use this one to open the FileMaker Server event log and scroll through it and look at it that way. There's also command line tools, again, because of its Unix underpinning, so you can use tail and some of the other tools to filter, use grep, any of these Unix kind of way of looking at a log and making it show exactly what you need. And then there's the non-OS level tools, right? So I just have Zabbix on there because that's one that I use. Zabbix is not the only tool that's out there. Some of them are open source, some of them are for pay. If you have an IT department, these are some of the other names. If you have an IT department, chances are that they are already using one of these tools that I've just showed there on screen, right? So it may be worth a while, take a little trip to the IT department and ask them about it, because these tools can hook into what FileMaker offers, right? You can monitor your FileMaker Server remotely, locally, and have some good information. And not just information, right? It can tell you how much memory FileMaker is using and how many clients are connected. It can also keep an eye on, say, the thread count for your web publishing engine. If the web publishing engine dies, the thread count will go to 0. And you will know that your web publishing engine has just died. And yes, you can probably find it out by looking at the event log as well. But these tools can proactively warn you, but they can also run command line tools. And that's where the FileMaker Server admin command line tool comes into play, right? So they can monitor whether your web publishing engine has just died and automatically restart it. That's what these tools do. That's what they do for a living, right? So, it's certainly worthwhile to explore them, especially if you do have an IT department, because like I said, chances are that they are already using this and you can just piggyback on what they're doing there. To wrap this up, I'll talk briefly about the Data API. If you were in my IoT session yesterday, you heard me rave about it because I'm going to marry this thing. I'm in love with it. Because it's stable, it's fast, and it's a great way to interact with your solutions, right? I like it. The thing to remember, it's not just an addition to the web publishing engine, right? It's not even based on the web publishing engine. It's its own thing. It was built from the ground up. And because it's its own thing, it has its own scripting engine. This is what I showed in my IoT session yesterday, right? So I have a couple of Raspberry Pis that collect sensor information, send them off to my server. I've been doing this for, I would say about 90 days today, so about 3 months, ever since FileMaker 17 was released, when I installed the official one. So it created 8.5 million records, probably closer to 9 million records. So they hit, I have 2 of those, they hit my FileMaker server 90 times per minute, sending data over. It just works. So what does that mean that it has its own scripting engine, right? So I wanted to highlight this because FileMaker Server has a scripting engine, the one that we know that runs our schedules and runs our perform script on server, right? That's the scripting engine that we typically associate with FileMaker Server. We know that the web publishing engine has one, right? Because that's the one that's being used by the PHP API, the XML API, and WebDirect. And now the Data API has its own scripting engine. So on server, we have 3 different scripting engines that all slightly do different things or can do slightly different things. If you go look in your script workspace, right, and you toggle on the compatibility mode, you'll actually see them listed there, right? So obviously we have Mac and Windows and iOS as the client OSs, and then we have server, data API, and WebDirect. So they each have their own set of compatible script steps. Now, an interesting thing about that is that the data API and WebDirect are considered clients, right? The server one, that's the one that runs the schedule and PSOS. But the other 2, if you find that you want to run a script step that is not compatible with the data API or WebDirect, but it is compatible with the server scripting engine, you can make the last 2, the data API and the WebDirect, you can make them call and use perform script on server because they're actual clients. Right? So even though it happens on the server, you can hand things off between those scripting engines and really get the best use of these available script steps to you. So I thought that was important enough to call out as sort of like a side effect of what the data API and WebDirect and the scripting engine brings us. Since we're talking about scripts, it's natural to think about plugins, right? In the admin console, we can enable FileMaker Server to use plugins and to automatically install them. Nothing has changed there. We're totally fine. We can do the same thing with the web publishing, XML, WebDirect, these kinds of things. The data API is not listed there. The data API cannot use plugins right now, so it's not listed there. The other thing that is peculiar about this section of the admin console is that this particular section here with the installed plugins, that one is completely blank until you actually install a plugin on FileMaker Server. So it's sort of like the dynamic, how the page gets dynamically rendered, right? So in the old admin console, there was a section there, a UI widget, that would show you your plugins, even if you didn't have any, right? But it would be clear to you that you didn't have any because it was a blank space. You don't get the blank space if you don't have any in Server 17. It threw me for a loop a little bit until I figured it out. The other interesting thing is that while you can enable the web publishing engine to install and use plugins, when you do and you install plugins for WebDirect, they don't show up, right? So this particular section doesn't exist for the web publishing engine, right? So again, there it may throw you for a loop a little bit where you say, but I know I installed it. I'm not getting any error messages on the fact that they've been installed, but why can't I see them in the admin console? Well, you just won't. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up for me. I'll open it up to questions. We have, I don't know how long we have. We have about a good 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So if you do have a question, please come up to the mic and I'll gladly answer them. The session will have updates, so I'll have my updated slides on there. Any links that I've collected will be on there as well. So thanks for listening. Jeff?
Does the calls to the admin API using the data service, does that count against your outbound data click?
It is not, no. Yep.
If I have Server 16 installed with an SSL certificate, how do I migrate that certificate to a new installation on that same box?
It's an excellent question. It's actually very, very simple. Oh, sorry. The question is, if you have a FileMaker Server currently installed and it has a custom SSL certificate, how do you migrate that piece of it to your new FileMaker Server? It's actually very simple. Provided, obviously, you have your certificate, you've stored those securely. If you have the server key.pem file that was generated as part of setting up the SSL certificate on your 16 server, then that's all you need, right? You install your FileMaker Server 17. As part of the installation process, it will ask you, do you want to do it now or you come back to it later? But the UI is that simple. You basically point it to where your certificate is, your actual certificate. You point it to where your intermediate certificate is that you got from your SSL vendor. You point it to where your server key.pem file is, and you provide your password, and that's it. So you don't have to go back to your SSL vendor and rekey your certificates. You can just reuse what you already have and go through the import process, and you're done.
On the script scheduler that you showed, the interface that you designed, does that allow you to disable and enable all script schedules as the old server console did? Because you used to be able to go in and actually disable all schedules and re-enable only the ones that you had enabled. So there's like a master enable and disable, and that's no longer in there.
Sure. So the question is, the old interface had that master toggle that sat on top of all the schedules, and you just had to uncheck that, and it disabled all the schedules. The new one doesn't have that.
Do you have that in that interface you showed, that you could run the schedules on the web-based, or that your company, I think you showed that example?
I don't know if we have it. If we don't, that'd be a great feature to add, because it's basically just looping through the schedule that you have and enabling them, but doing it from one place. So I'll take that back.
Okay, because that's one of the biggest disappointments. One, it doesn't list them alphabetically now, plus you have to click a link at the bottom to get them to show all on the current interface, and then that enable disable is gone. So that's one of the most disappointing areas in the new console. So,
yep.
Yeah.
But it's a great feature, because the admin API certainly allows us to do it, right? It's just making the necessary calls to get a list of your enabled schedules and then looping through them and disabling them. It's a little more work, obviously, to do it, but we can certainly do it. And I'm sure if it's not as a feature in some of the tools that I showed you, it shouldn't be that hard to add.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Two quick questions, actually. One, if you have multiple servers for WebDirect, does the list order, how they show, does that have any impact?
That's a good question. Yeah. So the question is, if you have multiple WebDirect worker machines, right, inside your configuration, does the order in which they are listed have any meaning to how they're being used?
Right, because the master always shows as the first worker machine anyway, right? And
yes, absolutely.
And then after that, yeah, does the order that they're listed, does that matter? Should we try to put one before another?
Yeah, I don't think I know the answer to that one. So I'll have to take that back and talk to one of the engineers and see what they have to say.
Okay, and then just because you mentioned the compatible script steps, I noticed that 17 now has the data API, and it no longer has custom web publishing, which had been in up to 16. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, the question is about the custom web publishing. It's not gone. It's still there. So in Server 17, you have the data API, you have the PHP API,
right,
and they have the XML API.
No, I'm mentioning in the script maker, when you can look and see the compatible script steps, and you pointed out, you had a screenshot and it showed the data API is up there.
Oh, I see what you mean. That screenshot where I showed the compatibility choices?
Yeah, and I just noticed that custom web publishing is no longer there. I'm just wondering if you knew anything about that.
No, I didn't. I think the one that it has WebDirect on there, right? But not the other one?
So 16 has WebDirect and CWP, and this one has the data API and WebDirect.
No, I didn't pick up on that one.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I have a couple questions regarding performance. You had mentioned that there's the old admin console had a fair amount of overhead. If you use the API, will that, to replace any of the now missing features, will that affect the overhead?
So the question is, if when you use the new admin API, will you incur some overheads that may make it as bad as the old console? It won't. Obviously, every time you ask server to do anything, FileMaker Server has to execute what you're asking. But keep in mind that using the admin console actually uses the exact same admin API as we are doing, right? So you're not going to tax your server very much by using the admin API. It's actually one of the cool features that if you put your browser in developer mode and then you start using the admin console, you'll actually see the exact calls that it makes to the admin API, just like we do if we use it directly. So I wouldn't be worried about the performance impact of using the admin API.
Okay. And several years ago, I can recall that a server session suggested having each of the different areas, such as, say, the application, the files, the backups on different drives. And now the default for nearly everything is in the same, in the FileMaker folder, same as the application or the service. Is will that affect performance in any way? I mean, is it no longer suggested to split things up among different drives?
No, the best practice is to still split them up, right? So that you can use different disk I/O on different drives. The default settings, as we've shown them in the admin console, haven't really changed all that much from before. So we shouldn't read into that we should now be using just one drive for everything, backups and live files and all of that. No, the best practice is to still split them up across different drives.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Yep.
Is Java still required for the admin console to function, or do you know?
Is JavaScript?
Java.
Java. You still have to have Java on your FileMaker server, but it's not required to make any calls to it. Were you thinking of disabling Java altogether, or trying to?
We have a lot of compliance issues with Java. Sure. Being out of, have vulnerabilities and other issues. So.
Yep. I don't think you can run your FileMaker server and not have it run without Java. So that really hasn't changed all that much.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I was looking at the FileMaker Server 17 admin console. I was looking for the edit deployment feature, and I wasn't able to find it.
Because it's not there. So the edit deployment feature that we had in the old one, the edit deployment in the old one really was all about changing the way that it talked to the web server, right? The ability to change ports and all of that, and make it reconnect to that. In Server 17, you don't get to choose what web ports you will have this run on. It's going to use port 80 and 443 by default. So you can change them, and that's why that edit deployment is no longer there.
Sometimes you had to, under 16, you had to run it if maybe your IP address had changed, and then it would sure. Re-enable the web publishing to the correct IP address. Is that still an issue, or not?
I guess it could still be an issue if your FileMaker server really shouldn't change IP address, but sometimes it's unavoidable if IT makes like a big sweep, or they move physically locations and dish out new IP addresses. I guess that could still be an issue. It's going to be fairly rare, I would say, but it can happen. I have not had it happen to me with 17, so I don't know what I would need to do to make it reconnect that way.
Well, as a consultant, my laptop moves around quite a bit, and it has FileMaker server on it, so the IP address does change. So it has been an issue in the past.
Yep. The way that I personally get around that is that two ways. One, I also have a FileMaker server on an AWS server, so that it doesn't have to move with me. The other one is that I use a virtual machine to run my FileMaker server on, so that virtual machine that I have on my laptop always has the same IP address. So it doesn't really matter where I am, but my virtual machine never changes.
That was the solution I finally changed to, but I was just trying to get clarification. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, so if we have no more questions, then I'll thank you for your time.